So I was reading this article that kind of piqued my curiosity. So the article is called "The Paradox of Tolerance." All right, and it makes an interesting point, and it gets to a larger issue, which will be the sort of topic of our discussion today. But here's what this person says. It's writing, and he's talking about the work of a philosopher of the modern era named Karl Popper. And his point was that this philosopher's logic, who's in the mid 20th century, is necessary for today. And here's his point. He said, here's the basis of the argument of this particular philosopher. He says this. Here's his point. You can only ever disprove a theory. And so here's what he says. You can never call a theory true. All you can do is relentlessly question it, test it, and observe whether or not its predictions align with reality. If they don't, your theory is wrong. If they do, you've merely increased the body of evidence that the theory may be right. And then he says, it's a fundamental chink in the armor of any scientific discourse which anyone who lacks an understanding of how the scientific method works or who has an agenda against it can use to question any finding. Many of the unscientific arguments you see pro-offered in the public sphere today take exactly this form. Prove it, or I'll take your lack of proof as evidence that my alternative is right. Popper argues the very opposite, that the very strength of a scientific theory is the degree of criticism it can be subjected to. Science may appear to deal in absolute truths, but it really merely is just a giant pile of evidence that says you're probably not wrong. All right, and so this person is basically saying it was a scientific sort of ideology exposing that science theory is really not necessarily about objectively being true, but having a bunch of facts that point to you're probably more right than your opposition. And then he talks about this idea called the paradox of tolerance, all right? And this paradox of tolerance, you probably can figure out what he's getting at just by the actual terminology. But this paradox of tolerance is basically, this is what he says. This paradox of tolerance, as it came to be known, argues that intolerant behaviors, irrespective of any judgment of the values that underlie them, ought to be actively fought against in order to preserve an inclusive society. It is important to emphasize this last point. Intolerant behaviors ought not to be judged on the merits of their underlying argument or whether the party who is acting in an exclusionary manner has the high moral ground or not. These behaviors have to be combated on the premise of them being exclusionary. So let me translate for you. What he's saying is that inclusivity, being inclusive, is what everyone should be about. And if someone is not inclusive, if they're exclusive, then they should the validity of what they're saying is not measured by their exclusivity, but by, and the argumentation should be to coerce them to be inclusive. And that's the culture we live in. So his point is that social media is sort of a paradox because it claims inclusivity, but the way that it goes about it is excluding people. Exclusivity. That's kind of the point. He's trying to argue that. It got me thinking as I thought about who we are. If you're a believer, I'm a Christian. I'm of the Christian tradition. I believe what the Bible teaches in its most conservative, sort of orthodox sense. And it got me thinking about this idea because there's a lot of pressure put on believers today, believers in Jesus Christ, that being loving is to be inclusive. And so as I read this article and I looked at some other thoughts, I wondered and I asked myself this question, is it possible? Can Christians really be inclusive? Like, is it possible for us to be inclusive? Now, let me make sure we understand what we mean by, we're not talking about tolerant, right? Tolerant means we acknowledge that other people who think differently than us exist and we coexist with them, which we do. We live with people. We got spouses and children who we disagree with on certain things, right? So we're used to being around people, but inclusivity is something different. And let me explain to you what this is. So here is the dictionary, right? Definition of, this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, all right? Inclusivity in the Oxford English Dictionary says this. Here's what it means. And this is in its most dictionary form. It says this: the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those having physical or intellectual disabilities or belonging to other minority groups. All right. In its most dictionary sense, you might say, yeah, we could provide equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise. In that sense, okay, maybe so. But let's just be honest. When we're talking about being inclusive, this is not what people mean. This definition on your, that's not what people mean. There's a different definition of inclusivity. And it's more along the lines of this. It's the practice. So I'm gonna remix the definition to what I see happening in the culture sphere. It's the practice or policy of coercing people to change their convictions to agree with yours. All right, that's sort of what the sort of social fabric of the word inclusivity is. It's the practice or policy of coercing people to change their convictions to agree with yours. That's what it means, right? So it's a sense of you need to agree with how I see the world or else. And when you're not being inclusive, right? So I started to ask, that's the real definition. So I asked myself, can Christians be inclusive? And I would say, no, we can't. I don't, if you're a genuine Christian who believes the Bible, inclusivity is not really possible. Not possible. And there's one verse that I'm going to use. There's a ton of them. One verse I'm going to show to prove why, if you're a believer, inclusivity is not possible. And in fact, to be honest with you, inclusivity is not possible even if you're not a Christian, right? Simply because if I'm to be inclusive, right, just on a general level, then I have to accept that everything on one level is acceptable. It's true. I can include everything. But people who disagree with Christianity or our biblical position wouldn't say that. They couldn't say that, right? But here's the real issue. Here's the verse that, for me, shows why Christians cannot be inclusive. It's impossible for us to be inclusive. And here it is. Hebrews 5:14. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. All right? This one verse proves that Christians can never be inclusive. Let me explain what I mean. So it talks about this idea that solid food, it's using a metaphor in terms of how one engages with the word and how the word affects the way they see the world. Okay, this is what it's talking about. Two verses prior to this, it's a correction. It said, look, many of you should be teachers of the law by now because you believe for a while, but you need someone to teach you the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. So in contrast, milk is sort of like really elementary truths, where solid food is like deep understanding that people who eat solid food are a little bit more mature than people who need milk. And then he comes to this verse. Solid food is for the mature. Okay, that's not a big deal. But then he gets to, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. So here's what he's saying. Here's what the author of Hebrews is saying. That if you want to be mature, right? Mature, if you want to measure whether or not you are biblically mature, it's going to be, you're going to measure whether or not you have discernment that is trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil, right? So it means you're using the Bible as the source of good and evaluating and being able to understand what evil is based on the solid food that comes from the deep understanding of the Bible. That's what biblical maturity is. It's biblical maturity is, at least in this definition, it's I understand the difference between good and evil based on what the Bible says, what the word says. Here's why Christians can never be inclusive, because it's telling us that to be discerning, you have to distinguish between good and evil. All right. So if I'm to look at the world and look at cultures and look at ideas and look at philosophies, right? And if I am, as a Christian, I'm of the Christian tradition, if I am to look and say, okay, I think this is good and this is evil, by default, I cannot include evil I can't be inclusive. I can't be inclusive. I can't look at something and say that that's evil and be inclusive and be accepting of it and change my conviction or to give equal access to this, right? The fact that I have to distinguish between good and evil, it already makes me discriminate. Buzzword, right? We are discriminators by design. I don't care what discrimination has a bad word, and it does. There's many ways that discrimination is used wrongly and badly. But we are called to discriminate. When every time you choose on a restaurant and you're picking, I think I'm gonna go to burger instead of the salad. You're discriminating against the salad. You're making a distinction against the salad. I know, I know. I need to choose more salads than burgers. I'm trying. Get off my back. But the reality is we are people who will distinguish by design. We're designed to distinguish between good and evil. That's what we're created. Because of that, Christians can never be inclusive because we're always going to see some measure of evil and say, that's wrong. We cannot be a part of that. Now, why is this important? We know this stuff, right? Duh. Because for many of us, the pressure to love is being equated to inclusion, right? So whether it's the alphabet community, and there's a difference between we tolerate and we accept that people are made in the image of God. Like I said on me and Strack's last podcast, a lot of the problem with the church today is we've made the image of God, image bearers, be a Christian ordinance rather than a creation ordinance. No, image bearers are all humanity. It wasn't, we're recreated in Christ, so we're something different, but all human beings are image bearers, right? So people are worthy of dignity, honor, and respect, even if they reject Christ until they die, even if they live sinful lifestyles, right? They're image bearers, and we get that. But we're called to be something, image bearers that image actually Christ, right? So we have to distinguish between good and evil. Just by default, if I say something is evil, I cannot be inclusive. But the culture that we live in, and I've seen many Christians question themselves, their faith, and even walk away because they think I'm not being loving. See, the loving that's described in the sort of the worldly righteousness, or what I call satanic righteousness, is to be inclusive. You need to be inclusive, accept all people. Well, no, I accept that all people exist and that they're worthy of dignity, honor, and respect, but I don't accept that I have to agree with every single ideology and take my conviction and say, who cares what I think because I want to serve your conviction. That's not being inclusive. That's called fear of man. That's called fear of man. So the pressure for us to be loving is to be inclusive, but to be inclusive means we have to ignore distinguishing between good and evil. Now, I'll say this in closing. I don't think it's possible for anyone to be inclusive. And if anyone thinks that they're inclusive of all things, then you have no brain. You have no ability to function, make distinction, and all of it. Because in order for you to even make a decision, you have to distinguish. You can't be inclusive and go in every direction. You make decisions in which ways to go. You make decisions on what to do, what to eat, how to think, what to watch, what to wear, what to listen to, what to read. Those are all, you're not inclusive of everything because everyone has something that they do not like. To be inclusive, you have to think, I agree with and like everything. And the only people who do that are in a hospital ward somewhere. They're in a psychiatric ward in a padded room, beating themselves in a game of chess. There's no way. There's not a person alive that does not have anything they dislike. The minute you dislike something, you're not inclusive. You're not inclusive. So, in closing, What you and I are being asked to consider and to do is impossible. No one is inclusive. No one. There's no supernatural being or mortal being that is inclusive. You and I are being asked to do something that is impossible if we're a human being. And if we're irrational, if we have the ability to think and we're rational, there is not a person alive who does not dislike something. But as believers, we intentionally have to be not inclusive. We have to be exclusive because whatever is evil can exist in our world. We cannot accept it. We cannot tolerate it. If we do, then we don't belong to Him. And sadly, and I don't know if maybe this is you watching and maybe not. I've been here too, so I'm not Moses coming on the mountain with 2 stone tablets. I've been here too, but I would say sadly, if you're trying to be inclusive, you're being unbiblical. That's not the definition of love. Love isn't, because love sometimes rebukes, it challenges. 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews 10:24, it says that we stir one another up to love and good works. It means to provoke each other, right? So there are going to be times we irritate each other to obedience. There's Romans 14. Some people think that one day is holy, one thinks that. And he says, look, who are you to judge a man? It's like, listen, some people will have different convictions. Don't impose your convictions on others if it's not sin issues. So there's so much data in the Bible. It is impossible to be inclusive. And brothers and sisters, if you are a Christian watching this, we're living in a culture where you're being hoodwinked, bamboozled, and run amok. Right? A brother told me to hit the Malcolm X language. You're being told that to be loving and to be faithful is to be inclusive. And I'm here to tell you that based on just even this one verse, it is impossible for you to be that way. Now again, there's no such thing as jerks for Jesus, right? But there's no such things as no distinctions for people who believe in Jesus. We make distinctions because we're trying to have our powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish what we should be inclusive of and what we should be exclusive of. And as Christians, we cannot. Our faith is exclusive. It's only in the name of Jesus. And under His name is salvation brought. And under His word is what we submit to. Otherwise, we're in big trouble. What do I know, though? I just got big eyes right now and a missing tooth. And I need to get back to work. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel. Hey, listen, man. Like and subscribe to the channel. I'll give y'all all this work. Like and subscribe. Hit the like button, subscribe. Appreciate y'all. See you in the next video. Grace and peace. I'm out. Go home.